We had a vivid display today of the reason President Trump's criminal defense lawyers do not want him to testify under oath to Robert Mueller's grand jury. John Dowd, who quit the president's legal defense team, gets the last line, the very last line in Bob Woodward's book, Fear, where it says, in the political back and forth, the evasions, the denials, the tweeting, the obscuring, crying fake news, the indignation, Trump had one overriding problem that Dowd knew but could not bring himself to say to the president, you're a effing liar. That's how the book ends, effing liar. Earlier in Bob Woodward's book, John Dowd does tell the president this. You do have trouble staying on the subject, and that can defeat you. Then you try to catch yourself, and you misstate something, and then bam. It's like Mike Flynn not remembering the conversation with Kislyak. And there's the president's criminal defense lawyer telling him that if he testifies under oath in the Mueller investigation, he will commit perjury. And on that same page of the Woodward book, Dowd simplified his advice to the president this way: don't testify. It's either that or an orange jumpsuit. When John Dowd and the Trump criminal defense lawyers watched what Donald Trump did in the Oval Office today, none of them were surprised, and all of them knew what they were watching was a version of what would happen to Donald Trump if he had to testify under oath, answering questions from Robert Mueller. In the Oval Office today, the role of Robert Mueller was played by Chuck Schumer.
The one thing I think we can agree on is we shouldn't shut down the government over a dispute. And you want to shut it down. You keep talking about it.
The last time, Chuck, you shut it down.
No.
And then you opened it up very quickly. And
20 times.
I don't want to do what you did.
20 times Chuck, you have called for, I will shut down the government if I don't get my wool. None of us have said.
You want to know something?
You've said it.
Okay, you want to put that on my...
You've said it.
I'll take it.
Okay, good.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely.
fair enough.
And I am proud, and I'll tell you what, I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck.
Imagine, just imagine what Robert Mueller and his team of prosecutors would do with a witness like Donald Trump. They would easily get Donald Trump animated and emotional and carried away like we just saw him, because that's what happens to Donald Trump when he's faced with resistance or a challenge like he got from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi sitting in the Oval Office today, telling him that he was wrong about everything he was saying and telling him that they will not vote to provide funding for the border wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for. It took Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi a matter of seconds to get Donald Trump to say, I will shut down the government. I am proud to shut down the government. How long would it take Robert Mueller to get Donald Trump to say, I'm proud that Russia helped me win the Electoral College. I am proud that I directed an illegal conspiracy with Michael Cohen to pay off Stormy Daniels and Kara McDougal for their silence in the last days of the presidential campaign. I am proud that I lied to the American people about my pursuit of business deals in Russia during the presidential campaign. How long would it take? Nancy Pelosi pointed out that Donald Trump was lying in the room today, but she used big words. So Trump didn't actually understand what she was saying. And so after Nancy Pelosi says he was lying, Donald Trump actually says, I agree with that. Here it is.
What the president is representing in terms of his cards over there are not factual. We have to have an evidence-based conversation about what does work, what money has been spent, and how effective it is. This is about the security of our country, to take an oath to protect and defend. And we don't want to have that mischaracterized by anyone. And
I agree with that.
And we are.
The mischaracterizer agrees with that. Donald Trump made the mistake of putting his terrible performance in the Oval Office today on camera because he believes the camera loves him. And he obviously really loves the camera. But no one in that room changed anyone's minds out there in the country today. The people who support Donald Trump's wall and his willingness to shut down the government, like what they heard Donald Trump talk about today, they like what they heard him say. But the people who do not support the Trump wall and do not want the government shut down, which is, according to polling, a majority of the country, they didn't like what they heard from Donald Trump. But it wasn't very easy to make sense of what they were hearing from Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, especially because of all the disruptions and interruptions and the wildly disorganized flow of that dialogue as it played out on TV. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have obviously learned that they cannot treat Donald Trump the way they would treat any other president in the Oval Office. They have to be willing to interrupt him and turn away from him and play to the cameras when Donald Trump is playing to the cameras. And they did that today. They did a good job of that today, but they could do better. The Democrats in that room today could have delivered a much more clarifying and much more humiliating moment for Donald Trump. When Donald Trump decided to publicly turn a discussion about funding the government into a threat to shut down the government if the Democrats didn't pay for his wall, the Democrats should have said, we expect the president to fulfill his promise to obtain funding for the wall from Mexico. Chuck Schumer should have actually put that in writing. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer should have co-signed a letter to the president before they even arrived there saying that. They should have put their position for funding the government in writing and added a note to it saying that the wall should not be part of the budget because the president said Mexico will pay for the wall. They should have forced Donald Trump to say in the Oval Office today, Mexico will not pay for the wall. That's why I need Democratic votes in the Senate to pay for the wall. And that's why I'm angry. And that's why I'm out of control. And that's why I'm saying I would be proud to shut down the government. Democratic leadership made the mistake long ago of releasing Donald Trump from his promise to force Mexico to pay for the wall. The most painful thing that Donald Trump could possibly have heard in that room today is Mexico will pay for the wall. The chant that he led and lived by on the campaign trail would have been the most painful thing that the Democrats could have said to the president in the Oval Office today. But they don't know yet how to fight Trump with Trump, by which I mean fighting Trump with Trump's own words, not with Trump's vulgarity, not with Trump's ugly, brawling style, but with Trump's own words. But Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have been in Washington too long and have become far too professional to see how easy and clarifying it is to fight Trump with Trump's own words. They make the mistake of approaching Oval Office meetings with this president the way they would with any president. They put a serious proposal together for funding the government, and they brought it into the Oval Office to discuss it seriously with the man who has no capacity to discuss anything seriously. Nothing. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have not yet figured out how to publicly deal with the unserious man who is the president of the United States. And so they did not force Donald Trump to wrestle with his own words in the Oval Office today. They did not force him to say Mexico is not going to pay for the wall, and so I need 10 Democrats in the Senate. Instead, the president lied and said he could easily pass a bill through the Republican House of Representatives and get a majority of the Senate to vote for that, the Republican Senate. That's not true. They probably could not get a bill through the Republicans in the House and the Senate. And instead, the discussion today seemed to be a discussion about the parliamentary device of the 60-vote threshold in the Senate that can block legislation like this. There probably isn't a government funding bill that could get support from all the Republicans in the House and all the Republicans in the Senate anyway. So even that part of what the president said is not true. But Donald Trump was allowed to hide behind the idea publicly that this meeting was taking place simply because of this troublesome parliamentary threshold of 60 votes in the United States Senate. But that's not why this meeting was taking place. This meeting was taking place for the same reason that Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator tonight in the Michael Cohen case in federal court in New York City. Because Donald Trump lied to American voters. Donald Trump directed the illegal payments that Michael Cohen made during the presidential campaign and then lied to the American public saying he knew nothing about it. Donald Trump lied to American voters also saying that Mexico would pay for the wall. That lie, that Mexico would pay for the wall, is the reason there was an argument today in the Trump Oval Office about the Trump wall. Robert Mueller is never going to force Donald Trump to admit that he lied to American voters about paying for the wall. But the Democratic leadership in Congress should never give up on forcing Donald Trump to admit his lie, to own his lie, and tell America that Mexico will not pay for the wall. The Trump wall will never be built. We can all see that now. And sometime next year, Donald Trump will probably stop talking about the wall when he realizes it is his most prominent failure, and he doesn't want to remind people of it. But the Democrats should never let America forget Donald Trump's big lie about his big wall. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.